Alright, so this weekend nothing really came out in theaters that I was really that interested in, so I figured this would be the best time, especially being the end of this month, to talk about Three from Hell, and I figured while I was at it, we might as well talk about the whole trilogy of the Firefly family by Rob Zombie. So, before we go into these, it is probably worth addressing that by the time we get to Three from Hell, I want to start with House of a Thousand Corpses and then go all the way through. Um, my thoughts may seem a bit scattered because there's something about these movies where even after like the almost 15 years since The Devil's Rejects came out, I'm still kind of trying to figure out how I feel about these movies. And I know lately I have been not very kind to Rob Zombie's movies, particularly 31. Like, I almost feel like they get worse as they go, almost, with the exception of Halloween 2. His Halloween 2, which I still believe to be one of the worst movies ever made. And I've seen roughly 11,000 movies, so take that for what you will. Um, but there's still something that I feel like cannot be dismissed, at least about these movies and this trilogy in particular, even if I may have a lot of negative thoughts, particularly when we get to Three from Hell. I do need to acknowledge that there is definitely something about Rob Zombie as an artist where, regardless of any negative things you might be able to say and how frequent they may be, there's definitely something about this trilogy that's worth talking about and worth exploring. So, especially when you talk about, why don't we just go ahead and start with House of a Thousand Corpses, which I did talk about like the first year we were doing this, like the first time around we did the whole October Versus thing. And I had talked about how time was actually being kind of kind to it. Like it was seen as like one of the worst horror movies ever when it came out, and everybody just really trashed it. But it feels like as it goes on, the movie seems to get better, and it's like aging really well. So might as well explore it again, like 6 years after the last time I did, to see if that remains. And yeah, I think for the most part, it does. Obviously, it's worth noting. We like just lost Sid Haig, and like one of the very first things I did was go back to this movie. It was this movie and Spider Baby, which if you haven't seen, you absolutely must, especially if you're a fan of the genre. So, and another thing that stands out as this goes on also is Zombie did an interview in like I want to say in the 2014 area where he was talking about how like disappointed he is when he goes back to this movie and how every time he watches it he sees more and more flaws, and it's getting to the point now that it's just not something he's particularly proud of. But it's like I'm wondering if, because I do think there's actually some like brilliance might seem like a strong word, but it's kind of the word I'm gravitating towards in certain cases, at least underlying in this. And I'm curious if the stuff that I don't like about it is maybe the flaws he's talking about, and it's like maybe the stuff that I really love about it, I wonder if he's still proud of that stuff or not. I'm wondering how much we line up. So, but I've never heard like the specifics. I've just heard that he finds it extremely flawed now. um, but to go into just kind of go into it in general and kind of we'll come upon what I think works and what I think doesn't is we have our 70s setting, which has since become, you know, a staple of his movies, most of them, and I think it's set in 77. And it's set in like this whole, obviously it's like that post Manson era, but it's still sort of lingering here, particularly in these characters where like the first time we meet the main characters, Chris Hardwick and Rainn Wilson, they're talking about like is Squeaky from girlfriend material and stuff like that. And the way they sort of combine, the way Zombie combines like horror movies and classic horror movies and his love for that versus like horror in real life, where we've got them talking about, you know, the Manson stuff on one side, and there's even the stuff like when we see the Firefly family like talking to the camera and that sort of grainy footage is like practically remaking some of those tapes of like the Manson girls and all them doing all the different documentaries and shit. But then you've got like the stuff at the beginning, where you've got like the horror introductions and you've got the Captain Spaulding commercial. It's like there's definitely something here that kind of is going to into the whole like classic horror vibe, and it almost feels like this is a movie that you sort of come across on like, you know, the public access stuff, like when Night of the Living Dead was in the public domain, and it's like you just always found that on like the first channel on your TV, and just embracing stuff like that, and the combination of those two things together, the horror of real life and the horror of, you know, like classic monster movies. He really kind of found a glorious combination here, and there are definitely moments where that comes through. Particularly with stuff like the murder ride, which I think is an ingenious scene where we have our first real glimpse of the character Captain Spaulding. Because like at the beginning of the movie, outside of the commercial, we're kind of basically seeing his cutter side more than anything else. When he violently thwarts this robbery before he and Michael J. Pollard can be killed. And it's this, it kind of goes into this whole thing of, it feels like this grounded in reality sort of scene, but then you've got like Erwin Keyes coming in and his sort of laugh, and it's like you kind of already get a sense of we're watching reality sort of kind of slowly transition into a monster movie, and it kind of goes back and forth throughout the entire movie. And even that opening credits sequence, with just that wicked imagery that sort of is, it's almost like we're looking inside the minds, of the individual minds of this family. But going back to the murder ride, we kind of see Captain Spaulding in like full character, in full getup, and he's like almost this ringmaster of sorts of horror, and it's like, once you get that vibe where he's almost like, he could practically be a cartoon character if he really wanted to. Even to the point that, obviously, The Haunted World of El Superbeasto actually showed Zombie going into animated territory. But then you combine the fact that a lot of the killers in this murder ride are real people, like Albert Fish and Ed Gein and all that. I particularly love the effect of when he's talking about Ed Gein, and he's talking about how he particularly liked women, and then it's like the Ed Gein footage, and it's like split screen with Denise's face. Stuff like that like really works and really kind of shows the sort of line that Zombie's drawing between the reality and the monster movie that both exist in this one product. And there is something like really sort of unsettling about it. Like it's one of the more fun aspects of the movie, the whole murder ride sequence, but then it's like the more you look at it, like when you see the recreated footage, it's like really disturbing and weird. And then you think about the fact that how long this murder ride seems to go when the outside of Spaulding's looks like such a small place. And it's like there's almost something like sort of surreal about that, how it just kind of seems like they're just constantly going down this almost bag of tricks of a space. And so yeah, so like the whole opening of this movie, like the entire first probably 20 to 25 minutes is just kind of amazing. And you can also say that about the characters themselves. Particularly Chris Hardwick's character is like way obnoxious, but it's kind of that thing where it's like, and you see the fact of like, you see these two guys and you're like, how did they end up with these girls that they're with? And it seems like nothing's matching up here. But then that's when you embrace the sort of monster movie side of it, and it's like, these are meant to be horror movie characters, not necessarily people you'd actually run into in real life, per se. And you even get the scene when they, like, when they're interacting with Captain Spaulding, particularly Rainn Wilson. And there is, like, it's sort of like the same, there's even a gas station at this place. The whole joke is that Spaulding's literally has everything from the murder ride to the fried chicken to gas, to the weird little shop. So it is literally the trope of the one gas station out in the middle of nowhere with the weird attendant. The attendant in this case being Captain Spaulding, of all people. And this interaction that he has with Rainn Wilson, that gets like really tense really fast. Because he just doesn't give the slightest fuck about what Rainn Wilson sees in this place. Where he says that he's had the place about since John Wayne won his Oscar, which would have been early 1970 because True Grit came out in '69. So he's been here for less than a decade running this place. He doesn't give a shit. But the way they build up the scene, like Captain Spaulding's about to snap, and it's like, in any other case, it would seem like it's build up for nothing, but it's like, we already saw in the opening scene what Captain Spaulding's capable of, and the fact that they're playing him off so casual when we return to him, even he's still cleaning up the blood from that scene when we cut back to him, and he's all normal again, like nothing happened. And it's like, that's just, like, we realize how normal it must be in his life, just blowing dudes' heads off. And they just play it so casually, like it means nothing, which is just kind of perfect, and a perfect way to handle that character. I think one of the setbacks of this movie is that Captain Spaulding isn't more of a major character. Because it's like, once he points them, and once he gets them hyped about the whole Dr. Satan thing, which he immediately regrets and wasn't his intention, we see him like one more time talk to the cops, and then there's the very end scene, and that's about it. But he makes such an impression. He's like the first thing you think of when you think of this movie, and that's the beauty of what Haig did with this character and this performance that carries through even to his limited screen time in Three from Hell. But then you've also got the idea of the horror movie side of it, where we've tackled the trope about the gas station. The next one is the mysterious hitchhiker, which would be Baby in this case. When they pick her up seemingly in the middle of nowhere in the rain, and she just lures them into the eventual unknown. Very much like we talked about in that Versus a while back. Very reminiscent of the sort of opening scenes of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which of course the entire movie seems to be an homage to, but that moment in particular of the picking up the mysterious hitchhiker thing. And I think this is when Sherry Moon, who would obviously go on to be Sherry Moon Zombie, is when she kind of shines the most, when she was playing a bit more of a mysterious and sort of unpredictable character. In like the first half of this movie is when this character was at her strongest, I think. But we'll talk about her more as the series goes on. But, so there's that, and there is Bill Moseley. Bill Moseley I do want to go into much more when we get to the Devil's Rejects, but for now, it does seem like he's playing a bit too close to his Chop Top character in Texas Chainsaw 2. But there's still something very magnetic about the insanity that he is able to pull off here, especially when you see the contrast of like the more, again, when you see like the more stable scenes, I guess you could call them, when we're kind of following Denise's dad and he's watching the news as it goes on through Halloween night, and the reporter reporting on these missing cheerleaders that Otis is currently torturing. The news anchor is also played by Bill Moseley, which I always thought was a really nice touch. It's like, I'm not quite sure what he's trying to do with that, but it's just a nice touch in general. And there is something almost kind of eerie that the news anchor is talking about them being missing simultaneously as Otis is torturing them, and it's the same actor. There is something, genuinely eerie about that. That really works, but it could also have just been him fucking around, like Zombie saying, "Wouldn't it be funny if he was also?" So it kind of works either way, which is kind of the approach he's taken with the whole trilogy. Is it really just kind of depends on the person whether something is really, really disturbing or just really darkly funny, and in a lot of cases, I kind of just fall in the middle, to where I can acknowledge that it's both. But sometimes it does sort of definitely go more towards one than the other. I'm of course talking about the disturbing side, and it's like, if you find the humor in this, more power to you, but you gotta have a really, really, really fucking dark sense of humor, which is no surprise when you go into material like this. But I do think for me personally, sometimes it works, and sometimes it might be even, and it's hard to say really, like, in a movie like this, what exactly is overboard? It's really kind of hard to distinguish that. But yeah, because and I think it's also just a matter of like how this is the kind of scattered thoughts thing I was talking about, where I'm still kind of figuring it out in the moment, even though this movie's fucking 16 years old this year. Um, yeah, so and also it was shot in 2000, so it's actually almost about 20 years old. Um, but yeah, because you get to stuff that is like where I think the line, like to give you an example of where I may draw the line, but I don't know, maybe okay, the fish boy thing is what I'm getting to, where we see what exactly Otis has done off screen to Rainn Wilson, where he has somehow morphed half of his body and attached it to this fish-like thing and like just deformed him completely. Um, while listening to the that fucking Brick House song of all things. And it's like, it's at this point when it's like, how far into Zombie's mind did he have to go to see this image? And it's like, I can honestly understand if somebody found dark humor in this, but I do think there are actual moments, and this is an asset, where there are genuine moments that are just so fucked up. That's all you can see them as, and there's actual genuine horror in it. Another one would be when Otis brings the jar to the dinner table of whatever or whoever the fuck that is. It's clearly considered another family member. Uh, and it's the moment when even Chris Hardwick is saying, oh, we probably shouldn't be here after all. But it's in that moment though where there's still like just a tinge of humor in even the most disturbing aspects of this movie, and it pretty much works. And then you get to like as the movie goes on, and it goes more and more down, like and deeper down into this fucked up rabbit hole. To the point that they're literally dressed as rabbits by the end of it. That's how far down the fucking rabbit hole we're going. It kind of starts to stick to its guns and go strictly for the horror aspect. Otis's affinity for skinning people and wearing their faces. And like I said, there could be in the Devil's Rejects. It kind of there's more of a sixth sense of humor to it, but as far as Denise's father goes, I feel like Zombie was going for a genuine horror here, especially with a little bit of I think the heavy-handedness of intercutting Denise screaming at the idea of Otis wearing her father's skin is for some reason intercut of like home movies of them having happy Christmases together. And it's at that point where it's like, okay, if you're trying to inject some sort of sixth sense of humor into this, the whole movies thing really negates that. Because the whole movies thing clearly seems to be only serve the purpose of bringing out a genuine horrific sort of horror out of it. And even despite the fact that we're going deeper down the rabbit hole by this time stuff like this happens, like just before this we've had the scene with the cops, which kind of feels like it's almost like the breather. It's the seemingly breath of fresh air in between all the freaky shit that's happening within the house. Where we have Tom Tolles and Walton Goggins as the cops. But they still managed to use these characters to bring the horror out of it. Because, of course, eventually, we know because we've seen a horror movie that these are going to be ill-fated characters. These probably are not going to be characters that save the day. But the way they go about that, where Tom Tolles' character is obviously killed pretty unceremoniously, but obviously that very much carries over into the next movie. But then you have the Walton Goggins scene, where it's one thing when they discover what exactly is happening in the house, which is a really great moment. But then you have this scene, which is one of the movie's strokes of genius, and that is and some people might think this is a bit overkill, no pun intended, I guess, the scene, Walton Goggins' death scene, where it's like, it's just him getting shot in the head. which in this movie is so incredibly mild by comparison to the other things we've seen. So it's like, how do you make that as equally horrific as all the other stuff we've seen in this movie? And it's like the way it is just dragged out. And every time I watch this movie, that fucking scene, you would think it would feel shorter because I know what's coming, but no, that fucking moment, that shot feels longer every time I watch this movie. And it's and it's like the way they were able to do that when it's like, it seems like it's a breath of fresh air because it's not as gory and we're outside of the house, we're in the daytime. It should be continuing to be the breath of fresh air, but no, they found a way to make that as, like, stomach-turning as anything else that we see. So, and then, obviously, that takes us into the climax where I'm talking about there, where they're literally in a rabbit hole, I guess you could say. And then it goes full monster movie, and, like, hanging out in the above world with the cops and, you know, the neighborhood where the trick-or-treating is happening and all that stuff. Even Captain Spaulding seems normal when we go down way into the tunnels and see what is lurking here, and we really start to understand where the title of the movie comes from. And it just feels like it takes left turn after left turn, even if this has been built up to a point. Like the introduction of the whole Dr. Satan thing, there is still, like, this whole other world to this movie, where it's like, you see it on the murder ride, and it seems, you know, to an extent some kind of fiction, but then as the movie goes on and all the horror starts to come true and all this stuff actually exists, is insane. You really feel like you're going down a tunnel of insanity by the time it gets to this point. And then there's the whole thing about the thing that is potentially Tiny's father. We're still not quite sure. I mean, Otis and Baby refer to Spaulding as their dad, but it's like this whole it's so vague exactly how this family is connected exactly. Which is what makes it so, like, interesting and terrifying at the same time. So, yeah, so I do think the first half of the movie is much stronger, and the more it goes down that rabbit hole, the more it kind of, really just kind of wallows in the whole, it's just not as strong, and it's also, like, it's kind of hard to tell exactly, is it, because eventually when we get into the other movies, the idea was to sort of humanize them. So it's kind of a weird thing to realize that and then go back to, like, the second half of this movie, when it's just them horrifically killing these people that were just driving through town. So it's like, if almost if anything, if this is the movie that's growing well over time, that might also be a reason maybe the others aren't, because when you go back to this, it's so hard to go back to the whole, oh, they're human, and dare we say sometimes likable thing, when you see just the horrific nature of the shit that's in this movie. But I guess that'll go ahead and transition us into the second movie. I think we can all agree that the first thing that really got everybody's attention about The Devil's Rejects was just the entirely different direction he decided to take with it, where he, like, almost completely abandoned all the supernatural aspects, to the point that it was such a conscious decision that apparently there were Dr. Satan-related scenes, one of which had Rosario Dawson in it, and he just cut all of that out because he wanted to take the whole Dr. Satan thing out entirely. And you can tell that he was kind of going more towards, like, this sort of 70s crime thing. It was sort of like, it's like these two movies are kind of like a reverse from Dusk Till Dawn, where it's like, where From Dusk Till Dawn is like just this seemingly normal crime movie. It kind of has this, you know, cool vibe to it, where it would be something out of the 70s or something. And then suddenly it's a monster movie. And it's like we started off as this monster movie, and now we're, like, slowly transitioning, like, just back into the real world. And it more or less just becomes this crime movie of sorts, but the interesting thing about it is, and you could say where this is part of, it really lies on whether this movie is successful or not in regards to what he wants to do with it. It does feel very unique in the way, whether you see them as likable or not, or whether you, for whatever reason, side with them in a way. It is a very interesting idea to have a movie like this from the point of view of the villains. Like, basically make a horror movie where the murderers, who are some of the most horrific murderers you will find, are, in a sense, the protagonists of it, especially with the whole idea to bring in the character of Wydell, William Forsythe's character, who was the brother of Tom Tulsa's character in House of a Thousand Corpses, who is now wanting to avenge his brother's death in the most horrific and vengeful way possible. Which sounds like, oh, okay, then we're going to totally side with the sheriff, because it's like, it's a natural thing, and these are obviously, especially when you saw House of a Thousand Corpses, it's like, it's clear these are the villains of the story, but the choice to completely and totally blur that line by making Wydell almost seemingly equally psychotic as the movie goes on. And yeah, but it's before we get into at least the second half of the movie, we do have a new set of potential victims with the likes of Jeffrey Lewis and Lou Temple and Priscilla Barnes and all them. Brian Posehn is in there briefly. And yeah, and then it seems like it's going to be one movie before it makes another sudden left turn. Like, it's enough of a left turn that the movie just is what it is. And it's this movie more or less grounded in this sort of a reality that he has set up anyway. And then we have this other left turn where it's like, you kind of think this is going to be the movie, them in the motel with the hostages, and at some point they're all going to reunite once we realize they are as connected to Captain Spaulding as they are. The only kind of thing we had to go on here was the last shot of House of a Thousand Corpses, and it's like, did Spaulding know Otis was in the back seat? Are they working together? What exactly is that? And then they just kind of very nonchalantly answer that question when this movie starts. It's like, well, yeah, of course he is. But not only that, but he's like as we were saying, either a father figure of sorts or a literal father. It's all kind of blurry, but that's kind of the point also. And we are reintroduced to the characters. We obviously see Baby and Otis are still kind of in the vein that we left them in when they're in the house when it gets raided, and it's clear not a whole lot has changed, especially when we see the naked corpse that Otis is sleeping with like it's a fucking teddy bear. And one of the brother with the tow truck is killed, and the mother is arrested, but they are able to eventually get away and then just continue doing horrific things to people, whether it be humiliating them or beating them to death and skinning them and wearing it, making their wives wear it, whatever it is they're going to do until they merge together with Captain Spaulding once they all get back together. And this is another case of Sid Haig doing something amazing with this character. One of the greatest lines in this whole trilogy is just the way he approaches that mother. And he's just, we know how threatening he is, and you kind of get that sense, and he's still kind of, the paint is like wearing off. It's like you can actually see on his face the blurred line between Captain Spaulding and Cutter as his makeup slowly goes away throughout the movie. And he says the whole, I have top secret clown business that supersedes any plans you might have for this here vehicle. And it's like just lines like that. Make this character amazing, and the way Haig says them so perfectly. And then the "Did I stutter, bitch?" where we can see the switch turn that we saw more drastically in House of a Thousand Corpses. But like I said, it's a movie that knows it's a little bit more grounded than that. So it's like his transition into threatening is a bit more, I guess, almost real in itself. Where it's like he's no longer like part of this, horror movie monster sort of thing. It's like it's going more into that reality. So where we're talking about there were two sides of it, House of a Thousand Corpses, and then it kind of jumped one line and is trying to stay on the other for this time. And yeah, and then we are introduced to other characters that we've seen in classic horror movies, like Ken Foree, mainly known for the original Dawn of the Dead, as Charlie, the guy that's eventually going to give them shelter, which of course his last name's Altamont, so it makes sense. And he hangs around with Michael Berryman, the guy from The Hills Have Eyes, the original one. So, you can see, little cameos like that all throughout. That's also something that ended up becoming kind of a zombie trademark. And yeah, just kind of their presence alone kind of puts you there. And even though they're actors that are known for, like, the monster movie sort of thing, they play characters that fit pretty well in this more or less real world that he's established. But still kind of add that certain, like edge to it, to where, like, we can sense the monster movie that lurks beneath it because of stuff like that also. So that works. There are some things in this movie that don't exactly work entirely. This was a movie I was obsessed with when it came out. And I've criticized Zombie's more recent movies, saying stuff like, it's appealing and, like, edgy and hardcore for people who are, like, 14 or 15. Not even necessarily thinking about the fact that that was the age that I was when this movie, like, rocked my world. That's when I got this shirt. I've still had this shirt for, like, 15 years, and it's weirdly still fits. And, yeah, there are some things that, I guess I found to be effective like that at that time that have since, way worn thin. Where it's like, in one sense, I like the fact that you can see the relation between Mama Firefly and Baby in the way that Leslie Isarook and Cherry Moon Zombie act. But the problem with that is that I have often described the character of Baby and Cherry Moon Zombie's performance in these movies as a cringe factory. Which is something I kind of still stand by. And like that's what I was talking about, where I was like, when she's doing, like, the mysterious hitchhiker thing, when we first see her in House of a Thousand Corpses, I think she really works doing stuff like that. And like I said, she feels, like, really unpredictable. But then when you get to the character of Baby, after, like, 20 minutes of this movie, you kind of get the idea of what the character is. And it's like Zombie's off camera telling her to play it up more and more and more as it goes on, when she should really probably be finding a bit more of a... It's sort of like she didn't leave the monster movie behind, like all the other people did. And it kind of... I don't know if it fucks with the tone necessarily, but it's just a performance that is not... I feel like it would... Because the idea is, it seems like the way the character gets sort of progressively more into what she's doing and insane, that maybe a more experienced actress could have had a lot of fun with this and made a really interesting and unpredictable character, and just by going as far into it as possible, going as over the top as possible. But this just sort of feels like... And I know she's supposed to kind of be childlike, but I don't know. There's just something that really doesn't work, especially as it amps up the more and more it goes. And it becomes less like a scary interpretation of a crazy person and the way they would act, and more like the way Hot Topic thinks crazy people act, is basically what it feels like. But I say that because it's in such stark contrast to not only the great stuff that Sid Haig is doing, but the more I see this movie, the more I see all the movies, really, the more I really appreciate Bill Moseley's performances. Because I would almost say, when you watch Bill Moseley, particularly in this movie, the way he plays Otis, I feel like he has even more of a grip on the tone than Zombie himself does. Because there are times when it's like, you can't really tell what Zombie wants out of the scene. You can't tell if it's supposed to be darkly humorous, or disturbing, or heartfelt, or campy. And it's like, it's almost like he's trying to be all of them at once. And it's just like, there are times where you can mesh certain things, but trying to do so many things at once, it's not really working when you try it. But when Bill Moseley is in a scene, anytime Otis is in a scene in any one of these movies, it's like he finds the perfect pitch, because Otis is definitely... Otis could have been another baby, where the performance feels very one note. And the one note is, look how crazy I am. But there's so much stuff that Moseley does that's kind of incredible. When he knows just when to downplay it, just when to be genuinely terrifying, and when to be, like, darkly funny. And the way he can just kind of switch to each one. And there's so many, like, nuances in between those two, is where the real beauty in this lies. Like, the way he can switch from, the way he seems to be having fun telling Priscilla Barnes to strip and humiliate herself. The scene is really effective because he's not playing it up like, oh, I'm doing this because I'm such a bad guy. It's just like, you really get the sense that this is what entertains him. And the way he can switch to saying to Banjo, I think it is, says something, and he says, whatever, the next thing that comes out of your mouth better be some brilliant Mark Twain shit, because it's definitely getting chiseled on your tombstone. And it's like, that would be a line that would just really sort of almost seem like too much, like it's too much to be threatening. And it feels maybe too written, but it just flows out of Moseley's mouth so naturally that you know that when Otis says it, he means it. And that's just the way that he speaks. And then, like I said, the sort of darkly funny aspects, where it's like when he's luring them out to get the guns that he buried, we know he's going to kill them, and the scene is tense because of it. And the way he's just, like, the farther and farther out they get, you're like, he is not going to come back with them. There is no way. And you feel that, like, kind of in your stomach. But he throws in moments, like, after he shot Brian Posehn point blank in the head, and then he puked. And then he brings that up in this moment. He's like, so, the whole puking thing, is that, like, something the two of you are, like, into? Like, is that your thing? And it just kind of works in that moment. It's, like, such a nice tension breaker, but it's still taunting to the character. And it's like it seems like this almost really complex thing, these moments that Moseley has to find, and he finds it, like, every time. Like, he always hits the right note when the scene calls for it. And that's something that I think is, if Zombie could have been in tune with the whole movie and the whole thing, as Moseley clearly is with the character of Otis, I feel like we really, really could have had something that was, like, almost entirely brilliant, rather than just having brilliant spots. And you can kind of say, for some characters like Wydell, where William Forsythe is amazing in this. Like, it's a really, really good performance. But his writing is shit. His lines, anyway. Maybe not his arcs, but his lines are kind of shit. Because you've got this performance that is, like, so filled with rage. Like, Forsythe really, really found that within himself, and you can feel that in his character every time he's on screen. And just that absolute thirst for vengeance, but also that, him going over that tipping point into insanity. Like, more and more with every scene, he's getting to that point where we know he's just going to he's going to basically be one of them by the end of the movie. But some of this is expressed through scenes, like when he's talking in the mirror. And it's like, it's a really great character in the direction that he goes, and they make it really apparent, in a good way. But the way they execute this in this particular scene with the mirror, where we can see all that rage in Forsythe, where he's really ramping himself up to seek his vengeance. But he's saying lines like, do you want a piece of this? It's like, and I know if he's that enraged, he's not thinking about being articulate or anything, but I mean, he's also a fictional character, and you're making a movie with a particular style. And it's like, if Captain Spaulding can say supersedes any plans you might have for this here vehicle, my clown business, or you can have Otis say his Mark Twain line, you can give Wydell better lines than "Do you want a piece of this?" when you're building up how truly deeply enraged this person is. And so that kind of brings it down a little bit, where it's like, it makes it sort of, I don't know, it almost feels more like it should be back in the over-the-top cartoonish land of the B-monster movie or whatever, when we're now, like, way deep into this, you know, almost dead serious crime thing they've got going on, that just happens to have a deranged sense of humor from time to time. And that also comes through with another Wydell scene that just kind of really fucks with that whole thing that Forsyth has really found, is the whole thing going on with the movie critic. Where, like, and it almost kind of seemed like a sort of, just a sort of bridge to help him get through the writing process a little bit more, something that was easy. Where we have the whole thing where, in House of a Thousand Corpses, when the characters are named after Groucho Marx characters. And it's like, that. There's really nothing drawn to that. It's just kind of a nice little detail. And it's kind of cool. But then to make it like a whole thing where, like, oh, maybe this connects to something. So they have this whole scene where they bring in this movie critic, which is, you know, seemingly a jab at, you know, the whole, you know, movie-obsessed people, the people that would probably hate Rob Zombie movies. And you can sense, like, a bitterness in that. But really, the whole thing is just a waste of time. Because it doesn't really get them any far. Because they talk about it like it's going to be some bombshell, and how he's going to find them. And no, the only payoff is, there is the funny moment where Dave Sheridan chimes in and says, we should investigate this Groucho Marx guy, we should bring him in for question. But this whole thing is leading towards the whole Elvis thing. When he says something derogatory about Elvis, it's the fact that he died on the same day as Elvis, and that news overshadowed it. And Wydell goes off on this whole thing. It's like he's gonna kill the guy over dissing Elvis, which is something that's never mentioned before and never brought up again. And it's like, yeah, there's, it just doesn't work. It really doesn't work. Because, like, is it supposed to be funny? Is it supposed to continue to show Wydell's rage? Because for one thing, it was never really going to be that funny. And another thing is, it's like, that whole thing brings down the whole, oh, we're really showing off his rage thing, because it's like, it's over something so fucking dumb. Which was why I'm thinking it's like, maybe it's supposed to be funny or something, but I don't, it's just a waste of time. That whole segment is a fucking waste of time. You could be doing so many better things to build up the Wydell character. And you've done them in the movie. You could just take that scene out, and it would be fine. It would be better for the Wydell character, I think, but whatever. Because they also add scenes like, when we see Ken Foree and Michael Berryman going to the chicken place. And it's like, it goes into pure, the worst aspects of what Rob Zombie does. It's like a fucking 5-minute scene just devoted to talking about fucking chickens. And it's like, if it was like 1 or 2 lines, it would probably be really funny. But I mean, it like goes into a guy completely and totally describing fucking chickens. And then Ken Foree turns around and relays everything that this guy just said back to the guy very slowly. And they just stretch this shit out. And the scene, like the movie critic scene, is fucking worthless. And it's like, I don't know what it is about Zombie that... House of a Thousand Corpses is a very swift, like, 88 minutes or something. But, like, as soon as he made that, and he got to this point, suddenly his movies all needed to be 2 hours. And they're all overlong. They are all desperately overlong for a reason I'm not even sure of. But, yeah, it's weird to think that if you're strictly talking about runtimes, you look at all the shit in House of a Thousand Corpses, and then you hear about this being like a crime movie almost, like practically in comparison. But House of a Thousand Corpses almost seems like the more restrained one when you look at like the way it's cut down, and it's like how compressed it is. Where it's just like the one thing after the other, and like every new scene adds a bizarre aspect to the movie that makes it weirder and takes you down that path. And it's like there's so many fucking detours in this that don't matter and don't add anything. Where I'm wondering if you just took them out of the movie entirely, because I've only ever watched this DVD after the one time I saw it in theaters, like 14 years ago, and this is the unrated version. And so I kind of kept thinking, like, were these scenes in the theatrical version? Maybe they weren't. And you can't necessarily judge a movie by its unrated version. So it's like... But no, I looked it up, and the time difference is like maybe 1.5 to 2 minutes, I think. So, so all this stuff was probably still in there. I think one of the things was the sex dream with Captain Spaulding was like a little longer than the theatrical version, and so yeah, the whole chicken fucking thing, the whole movie critic thing, was always intact. At the degrees that it was, and it's just sort of, yeah. But, yeah, so the movie does eventually take that detour of, not detour, but the different path where we think the whole movie's in the motel, and then halfway through the movie they're all dead, and they're all moving on now that they've been reunited. And this is at the point in time when the movie decides it's time to make them likable. It's time to tell you that they're the protagonists now. Especially as the more familial they get with each other, the crazier Wydell's getting. So I can see where the idea, like where the structure of it works, as far as building up the characters. But at the same time... like I was talking about, you go back to House of a Thousand Corpses and you see just how fucked up they were, and it's like, it's kind of hard to go right from one to the other and automatically say, like, oh, they're just human like everybody else. They just happen to also be vicious murderers. And when I watch the movie back now versus when I watched it years and years ago when I was obsessed with it, I had always been under the impression, in my mind somewhere, that there was a lot more to the transition of them being likable. When watching it back now, really, it's only the ice cream scene, I think. Like, there's the whole thing when, like, Captain Spaulding kind of changes the whole dynamic, when he's here, kind of, you know, being the fatherly figure, whether figuratively or literally. And it's like, you know, Baby is the kid. It's almost like Spaulding's like the really cool grandpa in this scenario, where he's the one, and like Otis is like the stern parent, where Spaulding's like, you know, oh, give the kid ice cream, it's what she wants, and then they make fun of him, they put it on his nose and shit, and he's like embarrassed and smiles, and it's like, oh my god, they're human. But then that's about it. I had always had it in my mind there was so much more to what made them human when you watch this. But yeah, outside of the ice cream scene, not really. Like that, and the scene is barely like a minute and a half. And it's like, that's a lot to block out of your minds everything else these people have done. And it's like, no, it's really kind of just evil versus evil. But there are still moments when they're being tortured by Wydell where I can get it. Like, but they're very fleeting. One moment that stands out is when Wydell is starting to like stick the pictures of the victims to them, whether it be staples or whatever. And he's getting ready. He has the picture of Mary from the first movie, and he's getting ready to staple her to Baby, and Spaulding like takes it for her. Like he takes the pain away, and he's like, "No, do it to me." And it's like, there are moments like that too, but they are, if you haven't watched the movie in a while, they're probably a lot more fleeting than you may remember. So that's what makes it really hard to kind of, to kind of go in that direction. It's a lot easier to think of it as just evil versus evil, which is cool enough in itself. And yeah, you can make them human, because honestly, it could probably be argued if he didn't try to make them human at least a little bit, a lot of people would be complaining that he didn't. But it's like there's only so far you can go after seeing the shit that they have done. It's and yeah, but the thing about that also though is the way some of these scenes play out. Like the scene where they're ratted out, and Waddell goes to Danny Trejo and Diamond Dallas Page and says, like, bring them to me. And there's this really great scene when the whole thing about these two movies so far up to this point is how in your face the violence is. Like, there's so many close-ups, and like the score is really loud. And like there's a whole bunch of screaming. He's trying so hard to get everybody in his movies to be Marilyn Burns from the last segment of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and just constant screaming and covered in blood and all that. And we get a very interesting and sort of nice take against that, where we have that song, To Be Treated Right, I think it's called, playing over this almost like peacefully as we see the carnage. And it's a really interesting, it's a way we haven't seen violence yet in these two movies, where it's just the sound of the music, and it's not an overbearing song, and it's like, we even get interesting moments like when Diamond Dallas Page gets their attention before he kills the one girl, by scratching the record that they're listening to. But in another movie, that record might be playing the song we're hearing, and it would stop the scene, and then we'd hear the carnage. But no, that's just something we see that the music is still going over. And it's a really, really well done scene. Yes, that is Elizabeth Daly, who Diamond Dallas Page kills in that scene. Who... of all things, you might remember as Pee-wee's girlfriend in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, or the voice of Tommy Pickles, now playing a prostitute talking about hand jobs and all that. And then, yeah, that takes us into the sort of Waddell climax. And this is... So, yeah, you get a sense of what I was talking about, where it's... You can kind of see the aspects of this movie and how they would go on to be the worst aspects of Zombie's later movies. And it's like this was kind of the start of that style that he found. There's a lot of, the frenetic nature in House of a Thousand Corpses that does wear thin eventually. Like, by the time it gets to, like, the show that they put on House of a Thousand Corpses, I feel like the freneticness of it wears pretty thin. And then he takes it to... It's still in here, but it feels like there's a slightly different nature to it. But it also gets very overbearing very fast. And I do get that is the point. Like I was talking about with the opening credit sequence of House of a Thousand Corpses, where it kind of almost puts you in the mindset of insanity. But like, when your movie's this long, because you have scenes like the chicken fucking or the movie critic, it's gonna get grating. And not in the effective way, in the annoying way. And that's just, at least to me, that's eventually where it gets to its point. But it does reach something here, and I do think one of the reasons the movie was as well received by, obviously not by everybody by any means, but there are people that really, really, really took to it, Teenage Me being one of them. And I think a lot of that was based on not just necessarily the characters and their arcs and all that, and the whole idea of bringing Waddell in and adding that certain aspect to it, but the way it goes out made an enormous impression on a lot of people, including me, where it was like, it reached a compromise. And I think that's why this movie worked better before Three from Hell. Because I was talking about how, well, you watch House of a Thousand Corpses, and it's like, well, how much can we really like them after that? And should we really fall into that trap that Zombie has set to say, hey, look, they're human? But we had a compromise, because it was, we can acknowledge that they're human, we can acknowledge that we possibly felt something when we saw them being a family with each other, when Captain Spaulding, took the hit for Baby during their torture. And the other side of that compromise is they get what's coming to them in this final showdown where they are seemingly shot to death in this hail of bullets, in this final blaze of glory. And that's the note that the movie goes out on. With fucking Freebird playing, which nowadays would probably be like super cheesy, but in 2005 it was fucking incredible. And that was it. That was what it left on. And it's like, that is kind of the perfect way to wrap that up. So you can see where we might have an issue with the fact that this is a trilogy. So let's let that be the transition to talk about Three from Hell. So the interesting thing was when the news broke, there were two different kind of mindsets, at least that I had, and I'm assuming a lot of other people did, and that was... Two different thoughts were, number one, what the fuck are you doing? That was the best ending ever for these characters. You could not have ended that movie better, and like I said, it was the perfect compromise. They got to do their thing, we got to actually see them as people, and then they got the consequences. The end. They suffered the fate of all their victims prior to them by not only dying a violent death, but what Wydell had done to them beforehand. It all wrapped up in this nice little perfect bow. So, what are you doing by bringing these characters back? So, the one thing that seemed potentially interesting was the title on top of the fact that they would have to come back from the dead in order to do this. And so it's like, are they literally coming out of hell? And then it's like, that would be perfect circle, because it would bring the supernatural back into the story where we started. There's like a perfect opening there. But that is not what's happening here. They just lived. They just survived 20 bullets each. So that's kind of an underwhelming start. And you can still see them going into like the realistic portrayal of serial killers in media, what they're going for, which works to an extent. Like I said, kind of keeping the whole Manson vibe, where you have the people outside of the prison saying, "Oh no, they're innocent," wherever that comes from. And they have those fan bases, and they're saying, "Oh, they're in love with them," and "Oh, Otis is sexy," and stuff like that. And it kind of really takes you to the, like, you know, the Ted Bundy stuff and all that, and the weird fan bases surrounding that. And it's like, okay, I feel like there's something here. And then Zombie did something absolutely fantastic. Because obviously Sid Haig's health was declining by this point. To the point that he was not prepared for it until they met up one day while he was like in like a rehabilitation after, you know, a health crisis. And he realized he was probably going to have to write Sid Haig out of the movie, as much as it sucked to do that. And so he made this really brilliant decision to give Captain Spaulding a really nice Captain Spaulding monologue that would transition into us being informed that he was executed by lethal injection. And that's what takes him out of the movie. And that's a really... Like, if you had to do that, that was probably the best way to do it. So, like, major props to him for making that change. So, having to do that so suddenly. And so, like, that's not part of the initial plan. But obviously, he'd already structured it to have 3 killers running around. So he introduces another family member of Otis, I think he is, played by Richard Brake, who had played Doomhead in 31, being the best aspect of that movie. And clearly showing that he could play a character that would fit within this family. But still, once we get past that, it does go into very familiar territory. It does become a Rob Zombie movie, but it was still like, I was trying to give it the benefit of the doubt. It's like, well, maybe if he keeps visiting this territory, that's where his strength is, and he won't fall into necessarily the traps he's been falling into harder and harder as his filmography goes on. And yeah, the cast is still here doing their thing. We got one great Sid Haig scene.
And then Bill Moseley is still right on point, like I was talking about, with all the Otis scenes. But then we have what's going on with Baby, where they have decided that her mental health is now declining, and she is now more insane than she's ever been. And there was like a scene or two here at the beginning where I was like, okay, how are they going to do this? Because the more over the top she tries to go, the more she ends up embarrassing herself. And making the character less scary and more a character saying, look how kooky and crazy I am. And it seemed like in these first couple of moments that she was going to kind of downplay it. Like she was a character that was going to have like that I've now seen some shit demeanor, because we were talking about how she's so childlike in the other two movies. It's like this is going to be maybe her transition into... Like, because I think there's supposed to be like 10 years between the main events of the movie and the beginning, when we're getting all the news and footage about them. But no, the whole look how kooky and crazy thing I am is gonna go fucking tenfold in the wrong direction. And she's gonna do the thing that kind of wasn't working and amp it up even more. And that's, yeah, so that's, like I said though, the idea of having Baby's mental health declining is a good idea, but if you'd had a better, more experienced actress, I think you definitely would have had much more to go on there, but, it just kind of goes, and she's doing, like, fucking voices now, it's getting worse, so, yeah, but then, there are still moments in there, like darkly humorous moments, that do work towards the beginning. We have Barry Bostwick narrating this little documentary footage that they're showing at the beginning when they're getting put in prison. And they're following Otis around. And he just kind of very deadpan says, the filmmakers who documented this film did not survive this. And it's like, okay, so... And then there's the whole setup where we reintroduce Danny Trejo's character, who obviously ratted them out to Wydell, so there's going to be a storyline here that seems to close itself up very quickly, but there will be doors that it opens as the movie goes on. Only trouble is that those are doors that are being, not even necessarily reopened doors that stayed open, and we're just walking back and forth in the fucking doorway, because we've seen this shit. And it pretty much hits almost all the exact story beats of The Devil's Rejects. And the reason that's irritating, because you can do that. Like, look at Terminator, where Cameron made Terminator, and then he made Terminator 2, which is the exact same fucking movie, with some of the exact same fucking dialogue, and he somehow made it even better, because he just made the same thing, but amplified it to an incredible degree we never could have imagined. And it's irritating that this does not amplify everything, only in the worst ways does it. And it amplifies its worst aspects. And it makes it seem pointless because we just hit the same story beats, because to bring these characters back after that perfect ending of The Devil's Rejects, you really, really, really needed a reason to. And Three from Hell and the directions it goes do not show off the reason to have done that. It's like if you were going to have some massive, massive, massive payoff in the final act of this movie that was like, it's all been coming to this. No, I'm trying to wonder, because I've never heard, if the plan was to always make a trilogy, because so many directors have, you know, their own sort of sometimes official, sometimes unofficial trilogies in their filmography. Like, you've got everything from the Inarritu trilogy to the Gus Van Sant trilogy. But it's like, I have a lot of trouble believing that Three from Hell was a movie that was always planned. It kind of felt like he was... It felt like he was running out of gas before he got to the climax of The Devil's Rejects. Before the climax paid off the movie and left us feeling, you know, positive towards that movie. But now it's like... What exactly was the end goal of bringing these characters back for this story that ends the way that it does? In a very open-ended way. Like, there's not, like, a particular sort of closing that happens here. It feels more like a middle movie than a third movie. And I don't know. So there's that. And then I was talking about the aspects, that were kind of the weak aspects of the other movies, that he's only made worse. Is the idea of the pleading victims. Like I said, he wants everybody to be Marilyn Burns at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, just covered in blood and screaming. That's what, like, the entire second half of fucking 31 was. It's pretty much the entire second half of his Halloween movies. His first Halloween movie. His second Halloween movie is all that, all the fucking time. And it's like, it gets to the point also when we have to stop and let the victims plead for their lives, and it's like, oh my god, these characters are so crazy. And it's like, it feels less like the characters actually coming through as being crazy, and these actually being really threatened future victims. And it almost feels like he's congratulating himself on the, oh my god, I write such crazy shit. And it's... Yes. And then that also goes through with the repetitiveness of some of Otis's dialogue, like Otis's whole shtick. Like I said, Mosley's performance is as good as it could possibly be with what he's given. But a lot of his moments, he has like 3 different moments in this movie that are the same thing, where it's, they say something, and somebody says, that's crazy, and he just deadpans and goes, I am crazy. And it's, like, funny in the moment. So funny, in fact, that Zombie decided to make this a recurring thing. But it doesn't feel like a recurring thing. It doesn't feel like some running joke. It just feels like the movie is so out of dialogue. Because after you have somebody say, that's crazy, and Otis says, I am crazy, there's a scene very close by where somebody says, that's impossible, and Otis says, I am the impossible. And it's like, alright, he did that again. And then by the time we get to the end, I swear to God, somebody says, Satan is coming to kill you. And his response is, I am Satan. And that's like, it feels like it's fucking half of Otis's dialogue is saying he is the things that people are mentioning. And it's like, this almost could have been a running joke. But yeah, like that would be something that would be so easy to put in a parody movie. It's ridiculous. But that's what a lot of it is. It feels like it's running in circles, it's out of ideas. It hits the same beat where in Devil's Rejects, where it's like you think the first half is going to be one movie, and then, oh, it takes a turn. But then when they take a turn, they go to Mexico, where Day of the Dead is happening, which sounds a lot cooler than what they do with it. Really, all it is them. It's just a long scenes and a long montage of them dicking around in Mexico. And it's like I'm talking about. It's like why is this a 2-hour movie? Especially when you see these scenes in Mexico where it's like nothing is going. And they're doing it. It's under the facade of them setting stuff up. Because it's like there's a whole portion where Baby gets in a knife-throwing contest with Gomi from Breaking Bad. And it's like, oh, it's setting up that she's going to throw a knife later, right? And it's like, well, we already saw her effectively throw a fucking knife at Priscilla Barnes in The Devil's Rejects. We don't need a fucking 10-minute scene of her playing fucking darts to establish she can throw a fucking knife for one payoff. But the movie devotes itself to stuff like this, and it's like everything feels like a dead end. You can see him writing himself into corners, and just not knowing what to do. So he just kills time until it's like, okay, we're gonna introduce these characters now, and they're gonna make shit happen. It's like, oh, you could have just introduced them, without the dicking around. But, it's, you already cut 10 years out of the movie. What's a fucking day, or half a day? But, yeah. So, and then yeah, talking about cutting while we're at it. There was a point in time where I thought the copy I had was fucked up. Because, there is a crucial murder scene in the middle of the movie, as you would expect. And this scene is so cut to shit, I have no idea what anybody was thinking. because we see it just kind of, we start with a scene with Baby that's eventually going to lead to them getting back to this place where the murders are going to take place. So we have Baby leaving where she is, then it just cuts to the almost set, like almost right when the murders are about to happen. Then it cuts to the murders happening. Then it cuts back to before the murders happened. Then it cuts back to before Baby got there. And what in the fuck is this scene? And why is it cut like this? And it's like, I would say maybe it was in a hurry to get to the gore, but it's like, it's so... I don't know. I don't know what the hell that scene is. I have no fucking idea. But, that's the way it is. So, that's... yeah. And then it gets to a point where, you know how I was talking about, Baby descending even more into madness. Well, this actually gets a bit confusing, because remember how I was like, oh, well, maybe it'd be better if she was a bit more downplayed, but it's like, oh no, they're gonna ramp it up and make her go real kooky and shit. And make her go as over the top as possible, doing this cat thing that she keeps fucking doing. That's not threatening in the slightest. But then, by the time they get to Mexico, she's the one that's leaned back saying, guys, is this all worth it? And it's like, I thought she was declining. But now she's gonna be the one that's, like, trying to figure out if this is all, like, are they all gonna end up like fucking Captain Spaulding on a fucking, you know, execution table or whatever. And it's like, what do you want to do with this character now? And it's like, because there's also a moment when they first get to Mexico. It's like Mexico somehow changes her entirely, like as soon as they cross the border. Because it's like, this is the girl that, like, had, like, jars with, like, whatever the fuck in them in her house. And it's like, she does all this murder and just degrading everybody before she brutally slices them into pieces. And it's like, as soon as they get to Mexico, there's a dude outside the hotel pissing on the street. And she's like, oh, that's real lovely. It's like, Baby Firefly is offended by a dude pissing in the street. And this is shortly followed up with her saying, like, is it really worth it, guys? Sort of thing. It's, what the fuck? What's happened? Dude, which character is this now? And it's like, I get that Richard Brake is in place of Sid Haig, and it's like, you can imagine obviously he rewrote him as like an entirely different character, but you can imagine Spaulding in this role, if it had come to be that. But it's like, it's almost like there was supposed to be another character here, and they're like, you know, just all of that's Baby now. It's like, she's the one that's getting more and more unhinged as she goes, but she's also getting more conscious of the situation at the same time. She's apparently getting more squeamish, too. And it's like, and more open. It's like, before they're in Mexico, she meets a guy at a vending machine, and she's like, you know, hey, you should buy me a soda. And then she, like, brutally murders him and carves the word grape into his forehead and leaves him there. And then they get to Mexico, and she becomes best friends with some dude. Just randomly. I do not know. And then this is eventually all headed towards a very predictable showdown with In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida playing. In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida playing during a shootout for the climax of a movie. That sounds really familiar, doesn't it? Like, when are we leaving homage behind and just saying, hey, we're doing Manhunter now? And that's just the way it is. It's like, well, it makes sense since we're apparently in the 80s now? Because a decade passed while they were in prison? But it still feels like it's trying to do the 70s thing. I don't know. I don't fucking know what this movie is. I don't think Zombie does either. And I don't know why he... Not only does he seem to not know what it is, but if you don't know what it is, why are you even making it when you had a perfect ending to the movie prior to this? Like, what was the... I don't understand the end goal. Like, that's my main takeaway. I don't know what the fuck is going on here. Because, like I said, there's not even really much of a closure of an ending. It's just like, oh shit, we need to kill another person to survive. So, spoiler alert, they kill the person.
and then the movie's over. Okay, that was worth bringing them back after their glorious ending. I don't know. But, let me just go back and say what I said at the beginning, because we may have forgotten after all this. I do really respect Zombie as an artist, because he definitely has ideas here that are really good, and he's definitely got, like, what it takes to make some, as far as movies go. There's, like, really some stuff here that could make great movies. But he just kind of keeps getting lost in his own bullshit on the way there. And it's like he's got it. He's got the great movie in his grasp, but then he just adds the same shit to it that doesn't work in the other ones. And it's maybe one day he'll find the movie where it really, really works, where it just absolutely fits right in like a glove. But it's so far, it's like, interestingly enough, the closest he's come to making a movie that's tonally perfect is a movie as fucking insane as House of a Thousand Corpses. So it's weird. It's a weird thing, these movies. But, like I said, if time can make a movie like House of a Thousand Corpses better, maybe I'll find my way, maybe my heart will find its way back into The Devil's Rejects, and maybe it'll make me revisit Three from Hell somewhere down the road. And maybe it'll be totally different. It's hard to say. Maybe Zombie is ahead of his time. I don't know. But I just can't imagine any kind of future where I find things in Three from Hell that are as great as the greater portions of House of a Thousand Corpses and Devil's Rejects. So, yeah. So that was me very messily trying to decide how exactly I feel about this damn trilogy. So, yeah, that's basically where we stand. I don't know how fucking long this went, but let's end it before we get as over long as a Rob Zombie movie. So this should do it for the reviews for October. So the next ones are going to be Terminator Dark Fate, Dolomite Is My Name, which actually was on Netflix this past weekend, but I was just gonna move it to next weekend anyway. So yeah, and then we'll finish out the horror versus. There's 3 more to go, and yeah. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.